All right. Good morning, everybody. We're thrilled today to have Mark Miller with us. He's a business leader, best-selling author, and communicator. Mark started his career at Chick-fil-A working as an hourly team member in 1977. In 78, he joined the corporate staff working in the warehouse and mailroom. And since that time, he has provided leadership for corporate communications, field operations, quality, and customer satisfaction. Training and development as well, leadership development, and more. During his tenure with Chick-fil-A, the company has grown from 75 restaurants to over 2,700 locations, with annual sales exceeding $17 billion. He began writing almost 20 years ago when he teamed up with Ken Blanchard, co-author of The 1 Minute Manager, to write The Secret: What Great Leaders Know and Do. The book you now hold in your hand is his 10th, with over 1 million books in print in more than 25 languages. Mark's global impact continues to grow. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tommy Spalding to tell us a little bit more about Mark Miller.
Great. Good morning, Florida Club Managers Association. This is Tommy Spalding, your host of our Heart-Led Leader webinar series. That, introducing my friend Mark Miller, was Dennis Goldstein. And Dennis is with CBiz and a great friend to the Florida Club Association. So thank you so much, Dennis, for all your sponsorship and support to the association. Great job introducing Mark. I guess if I had to add anything, Mark is our 8th of our 9th thought leaders that joining us this next 8 months of our Heart-Led Leader webinar series. And this book, The Heart of Leadership, is my favorite of 8 of the books that Mark's written. And what I love about Mark is that he walks his talk. He's an incredible man of faith and family man, husband and father. He is one of the senior executives of Chick-fil-A, and he lives the whole "my pleasure" phrase. Everything he does, it's my pleasure. Quick story about Mark. I brought him into Denver years ago to speak at our National Leadership Academy annual book and benefit fundraiser. And Mark was being announced to be the keynote speaker, and he's supposed to be walking up on stage. And there was Mark bussing the tables because he had a black shirt and a black pants, and he's bussing all the tables, picking up everyone's eggs and all that. Everyone thought he was the busboy, and then he walks on stage. And then when he was finished, he signed everyone's book and went back in and finished clearing the table. The only keynote speaker I ever known that actually done that. He's an amazing man. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my great friend, Mark Miller with Chick-fil-A.
Well, it is great to be with you, Tommy. Dennis, thank you. You're way too kind. What some would say is, although I've been at Chick-fil-A over 40 years, I've really had trouble holding down a job because I have worked all across the business. And I'll tell you one more story in the spirit of, transparency. I did start as a team member, but I was awful. I was so bad, I quit. Because here's the way it worked in my brain as a teenager. I said, I would rather quit than be fired. And so needing a job a few months later, I decided to go to the home office, and I walked in. Now, again, don't think too hard about the logic there. I couldn't do what they do in the restaurants. Maybe I can do what they do at the corporate office. I always tell people that should be no reflection on the professionals at the corporate office, but this made sense to me as a kid 43 years ago. And so I walked in and said, hey, I'd love to have a job working in your warehouse. Well, the receptionist told me to have a seat. And just a few minutes later, Truett Cathy came out, took me into his office to conduct the interview. Now, if you don't know that name, Truett is not only the inventor of the chicken sandwich, he was the founder of Chick-fil-A. And so I'm sitting there even processing as a kid, I wonder why the CEO is interviewing a kid to work in the warehouse. Well, I later learned that I was interviewing to be the 16th corporate employee, and that was in 1970 something. I tell people it was a combination of the lack of discernment on Truett's part and God's grace that I got that job working in the warehouse. And they also let me work in the mailroom, because when you've got 16 people on a corporate staff, two things are true. The head guy is doing the interviews, which makes perfect sense, and you get to wear multiple hats. And so it has been a tremendous journey. And what I want to do today is share a little bit about our leadership journey. And I don't assume that our journey is your journey, but my hope is that something we've stumbled upon, maybe some of the things that we've tried that worked, or maybe some of the things we tried that didn't work would inform your journey. So I'm going to tell you about really the last 20 years of leadership development at Chick-fil-A, and I'll do that quickly. I want to set up our topic for today, which is the heart of leadership, and then we'll have some time for questions before our time is up. So about 20 years ago, I tell people we began the modern era of leadership development at Chick-fil-A. Now, here's what I mean by that. We have always been a leadership intensive organization. Now, you may think, well, every organization is leadership intensive. And to some extent, I think you're correct. But our model was uniquely dependent on leadership. It was and still is. We have independent local operators, men and women, who operate our 2,700 restaurants. And so we don't provide leadership for the restaurant corporately like some of our competitors. We've chosen to embed a leader in each and every restaurant. And that was the model that Truett set up in 1967. And so we really knew then, and we know today, how central leadership is to our continued success, particularly leadership in the restaurants. And so about 20 years ago, we had a bit of a crisis. I don't think that's overstating it at all, because when most organizations are faced with a problem to solve or an opportunity to seize, you put a leader on it. And corporately, we were in a season when we had problems to solve and opportunities to seize. And we looked over our shoulder and our leadership bench was not particularly strong. We found ourselves saying things like, I think she can lead in the future. I hope he'll develop in the next few years. And what do you do when you find that you don't have any ready now leaders? You give more to existing leaders. And you can do that for a while, but that's a dead end street, right? You'll burn out the leaders that you do have. And so what we realized is that the growth of the business had outpaced the process for developing leaders. Notice the process, because it was really more about immersion and osmosis than anything else. It was young leaders, you need to pay attention. Now, at a certain scope, scale, volume, and complexity, I would argue that can actually work. I mean, when I sat around a table at lunch with the other men and women on our staff, I got to sit there with the CEO and the president and the chief financial officer and the chief marketing officer. And I was trying to pay attention, and I learned a lot about leadership. But by the time we got to the year 2000, we had thousands, tens of thousands of people in our organization who didn't have the opportunity to sit around a table like that and learn from world-class leaders. And so I was asked to figure out, how can we scale leadership? How can we increase the number of leaders? How can we get more and better leaders faster? And I did what you might do given a similar challenge. I put together a team of really smart people, and we went to work trying to figure out what is our unique point of view on leadership. And so one of the things we created during that journey was a picture. And I'm going to see if I can get a little technology assist here and draw you our picture of leadership. So let me push a couple of buttons here. All right, are you ready? There you go. Isn't that impressive? Now, if you got any note takers in the group, I know you're probably looking at that funny. One of the first times I drew that, somebody said, well, it looks like a chicken breast. And I said, well, that's not really the intent, but thanks for trying. And I said, let me give you just a little bit more detail and see if I can help you here. I said, now what does that look like? And invariably somebody will say a seahorse. And I'm going, man, that is not a seahorse. But I'm sure somebody in the audience has probably figured it out by now. It's actually an iceberg. And this is our picture of leadership. And I don't really remember 5th grade. You may remember it, but they tell me that's when I studied icebergs. And you may recall about 10% is above the waterline and about 90% is below. We think that's a perfect picture of leadership. The 10% above represents the skills of the leader, and the 90% below represents the leadership character of a leader. Now, one of the first times I shared this, I had someone shout out to me. They said, "That's biblical." Now, I'm a Bible reader, but that's not where I was planning to go. And so I said, "Well, thank you very much. I believe all truth is God's truth." And I kind of ignored them and kind of turned back to the group. And the person then shouted out, "You're not listening." And I'm thinking, oh no, I've got a heckler. I've never had a heckler. I don't know what you do when you have a heckler. But I felt like he had the attention of the room. And I said, "Well, sir, I'm trying to listen." And he said, "It's in the Bible." And I'm thinking, iceberg. I don't know what translations he's reading. I've never seen a reference to an iceberg in the Bible, but I didn't know what else to do. So I turned to him and said, "Well, is there a particular verse that you have in mind?" And he said, "Yes." He said, Psalm 78:72. And he stopped. And I went, oh no, he thinks I know what that says. And so I had to confess to him and the entire room, I don't have all the Psalms committed to memory. Would you tell us what it says? And he said, it's about King David. And it says this: David shepherded his people with integrity of heart, and with skillful hands, he led them. Integrity of heart sounds a lot like character, and skillful hands sounds like the things that you and I try to do every day to lead well. So now I tell people this is biblical. If you're interested and curious, there it is. Integrity of heart and skillful hands. And that's really all we're trying to do. Imagine what you could accomplish if you could raise up a generation of leaders with integrity of heart and skillful hands. Peter Drucker, the late management and leadership guru, some would say the best leadership thinker of the last couple thousand years, he said it like this: the quality of character doesn't make the leader, but the absence flaws the entire process. Character matters, but you need character and skill. So this picture helps reconcile that long-standing debate. Is leadership about skills or is leadership about character? We say it's about both. So we made a strategic decision. This was 20 years ago. We said, we're going to focus on skills and select for character. Now, I'm not saying that's the right decision. I'm not saying that's the decision you should make, but that's where we started our modern leadership development journey. And we went about trying to figure out what are those essential, we call them fundamental skills of leadership. And that's actually another talk for another day. So we're not going there because I want to continue the story of our leadership development journey. So for several years, we talked almost exclusively about skills, which again sounds a little crazy because 90% of the game is generally about leadership character, right? Very few leaders lose their job because they can't facilitate a meeting or delegate or even solve problems. Most of the leaders that we've observed over the years that really struggle, and those that stumble and those that fail, it's often, most often, a question of character. And so men and women in our organization, operators specifically, the operator, that's the person responsible for that individual restaurant. They came to us and they said, can you help us think about leadership character? You've given us a lot of insight. You've given us a common language around skills, but you've kind of left us on our own as we think about leadership character. And they said, can you help us put language and behaviors around the distinctive marks of a leader? Because let me point out, in the context of this conversation, we're not talking about don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, because you want every employee to meet those standards. We think of those as foundational character traits, but we're talking about those distinctive marks on the lives of leaders. We actually believe leaders are different. They're not better, but leaders see the world differently and leaders behave differently. And so our team went to work and spent several years trying to figure out, could we articulate a short list of critical character traits? And that's what I want us to focus on here in the next few minutes. Let me flash forward and say, these did become the book, The Heart of Leadership. And the reason I tell you that is because when we were preparing to publish that book, I was invited by the publisher to their offices. This is something they do on a routine basis, to let the author kind of inspire their staff about the book. And again, they do one of these pretty much every week, and I'm there, got the entire publishing team together. And I love doing that because all the money, any money that's ever come my way, we've given it away. So my story is, hey, let's create a great book. Let's change the world. Oh, and by the way, the royalties will help change the world too. Now, that's no knock on the people that are putting the money in their pocket, but I just feel like it's a fun story to tell. So I'm there to tell them this story. And before I speak, the president of the publishing company is going to introduce me. So this is, we're ready. I'm ready. I'm going to tell my story, tell them about the book. I'm going to share the highlights of the content that I'm about to share with you. He stands up and he says this: people don't read books anymore. And he stops, like an extended pregnant pause. And I'm sitting there thinking, this may be the worst introduction I've ever had, maybe the worst introduction in the history of the world. And he kind of looks at me, and I'm sitting there going, you're going to have to keep talking, because I'm not going to stand up if that was my introduction. I mean, literally, I'm thinking this. And it's almost like he collected his thoughts, and he said, and if they do read a book, they don't finish it. And I'm sitting there going, where is this going? And he looks at me like he's waiting on me to respond. And we're in front of his whole staff. And I said, sir, is that something you're directing towards me? Like, help me understand how I should respond. I mean, I said that in front of his whole team because I didn't know what to do with that. And he said, well, this book that you're about to introduce to us today, it has 5 leadership character traits. And I said, yes, sir, it does. I'm thankful at that point that he's read the book. And he said, you need to put the most important one first, because people aren't going to read the whole book. Now, I don't know if you have any experience with my books, but they're business fables, and they're 100 to 110 pages. So they're a pretty quick and easy read. We've tried to leave out all the extraneous stuff and just kind of boil it down to the essence. And he even said, you need to be sure and don't put anything in there you don't need. And I said, well, we've pretty much done the best we can. He said, yeah, but just be sure and put the most important thing first. Now, the reason I tell you that is I'm gonna share with you what I think is most important. But at that moment, I was actually not sure. And we ended up going back and spending about 6 months rewriting the book so that we could honor his request and try to think about these sequentially. It's not intended to represent a process or a flow chart, but I do think this first trait is the first among equals. So again, if we've got any note takers out there, I'm gonna ask you to think about it like this. All right. The first character trait of great leaders is they think others first. They think others first. Now, this is not natural. This is not intuitive. This is not instinctive. Most of us have been raised to think about ourselves first. And even the best leaders have to fight this temptation to think me first. And that's just not what great leaders do. That's not what great servant leaders do. So let me unpack these, and then we'll come back and see if you've got questions or comments or want to explore any of these. But the first thing is they think others first. Next, they respond with courage. If you want to know ultimately what is the catalyst for great leadership, it's courage. It's like nothing happens until a leader does something. Now, that first step is often to see a preferred future, but that even takes courage. If you think about what we do as leaders, we're actually trying to see the unseen and convince people that it is possible. And in many cases, depending on the scope, scale, and complexity of our vision, we're trying to teach them that what they think is impossible is in fact inevitable. But it takes courage. It takes courage to make strategic decisions. It takes courage to make people decisions. It takes courage to make product decisions. Our days are cluttered with opportunities for us to respond with courage. The third thing that you'll see is great leaders accept responsibility. You notice I make my own slides. I call the font hard to read, in case you're curious about the font. I often get that question. Here's the deal. The best leaders accept responsibility, ... and they're quick to give praise. The best leaders don't blame people. They own stuff. If it happens on our watch, we own it. Now, again, lesser leaders are looking for somebody to throw under the bus, but not the best leaders. Again, we could all cite examples. I'm one of the officers at Chick-fil-A, and I remember the day that somebody on my team, this is just us talking here, about 4 or 5 levels below me had made a mistake. And it was a big enough mistake that it shows up at the officers meeting. And I'm asked to explain what happened. Well, I had a choice at that moment. You've had similar choices. And I said, well, you know the outcome, you know what happened. I own it, my accountability, my responsibility. We're taking steps to prevent something similar in the future. Now, I'm not saying that's the most heroic thing I'd ever done, but I didn't get into, well, I told her and she told him and then he didn't do it and they didn't follow up. I own it. I'm accountable. And people tend to follow a leader who's willing to accept responsibility, but quick to give praise. 2 more. The best leaders expect the best. If we're trying to create a preferred future, we're trying to create a future that doesn't exist, people prefer their leaders to be optimistic, because if we're pessimistic, then 1, it's really hard to see a preferred future. And then 2, it's really hard to get people to want to go there, because we would tend to say things like, we're going to go there. It's going to suck. It's going to be really hard. We're going to hate it. People are going to die along the way. Who wants to go with me? Right? That is not going to inspire people. That is not going to help you and I become the leader that people want to follow. That's actually what we're outlining here. The leaders with these heart habits are the leaders that people really want to follow. And 5th and finally, the best leaders hunger for wisdom. They have a teachable spirit. Their curiosity runs deep. They know that the more open they are to truth, the more open they are to insight, the more they pursue wisdom, the better equipped they will be to serve. And so these are the 5 traits that we've decided matter most when you're thinking about leadership character. And here's the way that we summarize it. We tell our people if your heart is not right, nobody cares about your skills. Think about a leader that you know that has huge upside potential. Maybe think about a leader that has a tremendous amount of skills. Maybe they're really gifted. But you notice that people really don't want to follow them. If your heart is not right, no one cares about your skills. And these heart habits are the ones that we believe can set you apart as a leader and give you the opportunity to demonstrate the skills of leadership. Character alone doesn't make the leader, but the absence flaws the entire process. So that's the journey we've been on over the last few years. I think at this point, I want to flip it to you and see what questions you may have. This would be the group participation part. There's probably stuff in the chat over here. Is it possible to turn on your microphones and just ask your questions? Sometimes
I don't believe so, Mark. As we set this up as a webinar, so I've asked them to put it in the chat.
Okay, good. All right, so let's go to the chat. Let me see what we've got over here. Beth, you can help me.
I'm looking myself.
Yeah, this is the group participation part, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay.
I'm assuming they're questions. It's easier to say what I just said than it is to do it. So if you want to talk tactics, I'll be delighted to go there.
I apologize, Mr. Miller. It doesn't look like I see any coming through, but I know there's tons of questions out there because that's just the way the group is. So I apologize for that.
Mark,
Okay.
this is Tommy Spalding.
Tommy can take the first one.
I would love to know, and I think the manager would love to know, how did the phrase "my pleasure" start, and how do you keep that up in an authentic, genuine way as part of your culture?
Well, the my pleasure story actually comes from the heart and mind of Truett Cathy, our founder. About 13, 14 years ago, he stood up at our annual event and said, when someone says thank you, I want you to say my pleasure. And people generally thought, well, that's interesting. And some thought that's odd. And the truth is, not much happened. So the following year at our annual event, Truett, the founder, stands back up and he said, hey, last year, I asked you to say my pleasure when somebody says thank you, and I'm not sure you heard me. He said, so let's practice. And he said, I'm going to say thank you. You're going to say my pleasure. Everybody stand up. Let's practice this. And it's like, oh, okay. He might be serious. And so we got a little bit of traction. He showed up the third year at the annual meeting and says, hey, the last 2 years, we've talked about this my pleasure thing, and I'm really serious. We're going to do this. Let's practice. He did that every year for 10 years. It's a testimony to what I call strategic repetition, and the fact that he's actually serious about this. And so we began building it into our training. Operators began to build it into their training with their team members, and it has become part of the culture primarily, or you might argue almost exclusively, because Truett said, this is what we're going to do. And it is an expectation. And so now let me quickly add, from that, Dan, Truett's son, who is now our chairman, he had what I would call a strategic insight. And I won't go into all the details, but he decided that, yes, that might be a signature phrase for us, but obviously we would all acknowledge that's just a tactic. And not that it's not a good tactic, but it's just a tactic. And Dan said, I think we've got an opportunity here to create competitive advantage if we expand this and elevate this beyond being a tactic. He said, I think hospitality could become our competitive advantage. And you all know how competitive advantage works. It's when you figure something out that your competition has not yet figured out, and it gives you advantage. And so Dan said, we're going to do a full court press on creating a culture of hospitality. And we've done many, many, many other things over the last decade, 13 years to be exact now, to try and create this culture of hospitality. Now, we have been prepared and have been working on what's the next opportunity for competitive advantage. And honestly, my point of view is I'm shocked that others haven't already seized this, because that's the way competitive advantage works. When other people see it and it works, they embrace it, and you've just lost your competitive advantage. That now becomes baseline, and you've got to do something else. Now, again, a quick theory on why our competitors have not created cultures of hospitality in their restaurants is that typically quick service restaurants don't have the caliber and level of leadership that we have in our operators. So it's actually a hard play to run when you've got 250,000 teenagers with 100% turnover. It's really hard to create a culture of hospitality, but we've done it, again, with full credit, Dan's vision, but our operators in the local restaurants have embraced this idea. And now we're actually showing up on national surveys of top organizations for hospitality in America. And so that's maybe a big answer. It started with my pleasure, but it really became bigger than that.
Thanks, Mark.
Mark, we have some questions.
Oh, good. The chat is on. All right, Beth, will you be my moderator? Pick
will.
something. Pick something.
Understanding that all things change, what do you see the next new evolution in management?
Well, let's start with an easy question, okay? Not that one. Wow. All right. Well, I'm biased because we are trying to look to the future, and I'll tell you the near-term future, leaders, I believe, have tremendous untapped potential as they think about the culture in their organization. We have just finished a few weeks ago, a couple months ago, a study. We have either interviewed, surveyed, or done focus groups with over 5,000 folks in 10 countries on the topic of culture. And one of the things that has been shocking, there are two statistics that I would use to undergird my answer. I think there's huge untapped potential in the arena of culture. One is that 71% of the leaders say it's most important. It's the most important tool that they have at their disposal. Yet it's 8th in their list of priorities, and only 30% give any intentional time to focusing on culture. So again, huge disconnect, and we're still trying to get our head around it. Do 70% of the leaders say it's important because they believe it, or because that's what they've heard, or that's what they've been told? But if only a third are actually thoughtfully, strategically working on culture, what an opportunity. But perhaps the more telling data is that there is a 40% gap, generally 30 to 40, but closer to 40% gap between what leaders say about their culture and what frontline people say about their culture. So if the leader says it's an 8 on a 10-point scale, the people doing the work say the culture is a 4. And of course, I think we know either from what others have told us or experientially, all of the advantages that we enjoy as an organization when we have a strong, thriving, and vibrant culture. but the state of culture is a wreck globally right now, and leaders are the only ones that can fix it. So I think we've got some heavy lifting to do. And again, tremendous untapped potential in the arena of culture. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but that's what we're thinking about and studying right now, that we plan to share our findings in 2023 on that work.
Thank you. The question was asked, I'd love to hear more customer service wow moment stories from Chick-fil-A. I know you have a whole marketing campaign going on around that right now on TV, but what is one of the biggest moments of wow that you've seen in your career at one of your restaurants?
There are quite a few. We have remarkable restaurant operators, and they have attracted remarkable team members by and large. And so we get these stories on a regular basis. I think maybe the most recent big wow was the team member that went out through the drive-through window, like didn't even go outside. He went out through the window because there was a child who was choking. The seatbelt was choking a child. And the mother realized it. She said, "Do you have some scissors? My child here is choking." And the kid went out the window, pulled out his pocket knife, and cut the seatbelt and saved the kid. So it's like, well, that's pretty crazy. Thankful he happened to be carrying his knife that day. So yeah, just we hear stories like that all the time. You know, one more fun. I say fun. I'm thankful this happened. This is not even a news story, but the team member that noticed one of their regular one of their regular customers had not been in the restaurant that day. And so they went to the house where they lived to check on him. And it was an elderly gentleman, and he had fallen, and they got help for him. But it was a team member that said, "Yeah, he's here every day. Something must be wrong." And they went to his house. So, you know, you hear those kind of stories, and you're just thankful to be part of an organization that creates those kind of stories.
That's great. A couple of these are two questions that I'm going to put together because they kind of go together. What are some hiring tips and hiring and training tips that you all are employing right now, combining the labor market shortage and only drive-through? What are you doing from the standpoint of hiring and training in that circumstance?
Okay, well, yeah, I'll give you a few thoughts. Hopefully I can add a little value here, but I want to underscore, we've got 2,700 independent businesses. And so there is no universal what we are doing. One size doesn't fit all anyway. You know, every community, every market is different. So our operators have demonstrated extreme resilience and a whole lot of creativity. So there are a lot of best practices out there, but we did some research a few years ago on what attracts top talent. And I won't chase this, but for just a second, honestly, we wanted to purchase some research on what attracts top talent. And I was going to share it with our Chick-fil-A family, because even before COVID, we were struggling finding and keeping great people. We've got about 70% of our workforce are teenagers with about 100% turnover. And it's just an ongoing challenge for our restaurant operators. But we couldn't find any research. So we commissioned the first ever research that we're aware of in the history of the world on what attracts top talent. And I wrote about this in a book called Talent Magnet. But the gist of it is top talent wants things different than typical talent. And so really, really quick, let me just share a few thoughts. Top talent wants a better boss. They actually want to be well led. And you say, well, doesn't everybody want a better boss? Well, sure, at some level, but typical talent will work for a crappy boss. top talent, they're a flight risk immediately if they're not well led. And if they sense that they're not going to be well led, they're not even going to come to work for you. So we've challenged our operators. We're about to do a meeting with all of our operators, and we're challenging them to continue to grow their leaders. The leaders, you think they're just needed for operations, and they are needed for operations. They're needed to attract and retain great people. So top talent, they want a better boss. 2, they want a brighter future. And you say, well, doesn't everybody want a brighter future? Well, sure, at some level, but typical talent, the future to them is Friday. And that's not a criticism. That's just their time horizon. Top talent is thinking further into the future. They actually come into an interview with a different set of questions. They're asking, what am I going to learn? How am I going to grow? How am I going to be stretched? What kind of opportunities am I going to have? And how is this job going to prepare me for a brighter future? And so we've challenged operators, even in these hard times, you've got to have that as part of your value proposition. I might argue it's more important now than ever, or you're not going to get these people in the door. And what typically happens is if you get top talent in and you're not doing these things, if they're not well led, if they don't feel like they're making progress towards a brighter future, they're actually going to leave. And then third and finally, I'll just share briefly, top talent wants to be part of a bigger vision. Typical talent's usually not thinking about that. So if you've got the opportunity or the liberty to give back to your community, to give back to society in whatever form makes sense for your organization, that is actually very attractive to top talent. So our operators, even in the midst of COVID, we're encouraging them, don't forget what top talent wants. I mean, you can get more people by paying a little more, but they're not probably the people you want. And if you happen to get lucky and get top talent, they're probably not going to stay.
Thank you, Mark. I think we are through our questions, but everybody said thank you for your answers, and we thank you.
All right, let me see. Anything else? It looks like I've got some more on mine. Are these questions we don't want to ask? Let me see. Here's one.
I might not be seeing them because they may have come directly to you.
They may have come directly to me. Yeah. I do have a couple here. All right. Who inspired you most in the course of your career and why? It probably goes back over 40 years, literally over 40 years. I guess I was 19 at the time. I might have turned 20 when my supervisor, and I'm condensing and paraphrasing, but let me give you the essence of this conversation. So imagine this, I'm 19 years old, maybe 20. And my supervisor says, you need to understand how the world works. And I'm thinking, sure, I'd love to know how the world works, right? This is not on my mind as a kid. I mean, honestly, right? I mean, I'm going to college, but I'm going at night because I'm working full time. And yeah, like, help me understand how the world works. And he said, your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead. Your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead. Now, that may not sound profound to you, and I'm not even sure that I fully embraced the magnitude of that way back then. But I do remember making a decision. It's a decision my parents wish I'd made much earlier because I was a lousy student growing up. School just didn't interest me, and I could make, decent grades without actually applying myself. But when he said, your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead, I thought about that. And I said, so what does that mean? I said, well, for me, it means if I want more opportunity, if I want more influence, and I want more impact, oh, and by the way, generally income follows those things, I think I need to make a commitment to lifelong learning. And so I made that commitment over 40 years ago. Now, I was telling this story to someone recently, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Gallup's organization did a thing called Strength Finders. And I think there are 34 or 36 strengths, and all of us have some strengths. And people love Strength Finders because who doesn't want to know what you're good at? That's another story too. But so we had all taken the Strength Finders in our organization a few years back. And the person that said, this is probably easy for you. And I said, well, why would you say that? And they said, well, I bet you're a learner. Learner is one of those strengths. And some people have that naturally. It's part of their DNA. It's part of their wiring. And I said, learner's not in my top 5. They talk a lot about top 5. I said, I don't think it's in top 10. It may not be in my top 20. And they said, yeah, but you act like a learner. And I said, well, thanks. I made a decision decades ago that because I wanted more opportunity, I wanted more influence, I wanted more impact, and I believed that that would ultimately end up with more income, I made the strategic decision to commit to lifelong learning. And so I look back on that and thank that supervisor talking to the kid and helping me understand, at least from his perspective, here's how the world works. And in my case, I think he was right. So hope that helps. All right. Anything else?
There is one here, Mark, that talks about the biggest hurdle and bump that the company has seen and how you overcame it.
The biggest hurdle. Well, the biggest hurdle we continue to grapple with pre-COVID, now, and as we move into the future, is what we call leadership capacity. And I'm assuming that you've all encountered this at some level, right? There comes a time when the leader can't touch everything and the leader can't do everything. It's not because of lack of passion or lack of commitment or lack of desire. It's probably not even lack of skill. It's reach, it's scope, right? We tell our leaders, we hope that you lead something so big that you can't do it all by yourself. Because if you can do it all by yourself, it's probably not that big. And who wants to lead something small if you have a choice of leading something big? And so we are continuing. I've already referenced at this annual meeting, we're bringing all of the restaurant operators, their spouses, all the corporate staff and their spouses. There'll be 10,000 of us together for several days. And we're saying our future is bright and it hinges on our ability to lead well. You're going to have to up your game as a leader, and you're going to have to help those around you up their game. Leadership capacity is the lid on our organization. And I think it's the lid on virtually every organization. So one example of this, a few years ago, our restaurants were struggling. This was probably 15 years ago or so. We noticed some of our top performers, the performance had actually plateaued. And we were trying to figure out, like, what's up with this? We didn't think it was market conditions. We believed that the men and women in those restaurants were strong leaders. And we began to try and figure out what's going on. And it was this whole question of leadership capacity. It had gotten so big, they couldn't do it anymore the way they had been doing it. And they had become the lid on their organization. And so we began encouraging our restaurants to build leadership teams. And I don't know, I'm assuming most of you have a leadership team. There are a lot of advantages of having a leadership team. We don't, unless you want to get into that, we don't have to get into that. But chief among the advantages is it multiplies leadership capacity. So no matter how fast and bright and smart and talented you are as a leader, you put 4, 5, 6 leaders around a table, your leadership capacity just went up. And one story, we had an operator whose personal income went up $250,000 from a single restaurant in 1 year after he put a leadership team in place. More leadership capacity is a really good thing. And so I've already said, we're a leadership intensive organization. Our challenge, the restaurant's challenge, today and into the future, it will hinge, our future hinges on the extent to which the restaurants can grow leaders. And we're working on it all the time.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's all the questions that I'm seeing here that are in my queue.
Okay, well, let me do this. Let me give you my cell number, because some of you are going to come up with a question later, and I'd be delighted to talk to you if I can figure out how to make this work. Six 678-612-8441. Call or text. If you call and I'm not in a meeting, I'll take your call, but I get lots of text messages. So any questions, if I can serve you in any way, please let me know. And I have a website, and let me reiterate what I said a moment ago. I'm really not selling anything. I mean, we do sell stuff, but the money goes to charity. I believe I'm on this earth to encourage and equip leaders. And one way we do that is with resources. So if you would like to check that out, you can go to markmillerleadership.com. If that would be helpful, then that'd be fantastic. So let me wrap our time here by telling you a quick story. This happened just a few years ago. I had a social media publicist person that was trying to help me sell books. And they said, hey, we've got an idea. I'm going, okay, which is good. I mean, that's what we pay them for, to have ideas. But they said it with this little strange tone in their voice. So I'm thinking, am I about to get in trouble here? And they said, would you like to participate in a tweet chat? And I said, I don't know what a tweet chat is. Now, I don't know if you do or not. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I said, you're going to need to explain it to me before I answer the question. And they said, well, a tweet chat is sort of like talking to the whole world at one time. And I said, well, I don't mind talking to the whole world. In fact, I'd like the opportunity to talk to the whole world, but how do you do that at one time? And they said, well, if you're willing to do it, we'll walk you through it. And I said, okay, keep talking. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to schedule this tweet chat. I said, okay, I'll trust you to do that. I don't know how to do that. They said, yeah, we'll schedule it. And they said, we will begin by asking you a question, and everybody will see the question. Everybody in the Twitter sphere will see the question, and you get to answer the question. I said, okay. And they said, then everybody else will respond to your answer. And I said, who's everybody else? And they said, everybody on Twitter. I'm going, well, this could be interesting. And I said, so is that it? And they said, no. They said, every 5 minutes, we post a new question and we'd repeat the process. And I said, how long are we going to do this? And they said, we're going to do it for an hour. And I'm sitting there going, okay, let's give it a shot. So they asked me a question, I answered it, and sure enough, a few people responded, and then I responded, and we sort of had a conversation. It's kind of weird. It's on Twitter, really short answers. And then a thought leader in Europe jumped on, and they happened to have 400,000 followers. And so I don't even know how all that works, but when they jumped on, a lot of people jumped on. And so the next question, the answers are like scrolling by, from other people. It's like, I'm like, can we slow this thing down? I can't read these things. I mean, we're literally trying to have a conversation with people all over the world. And let me just say, it was fun and it was exhausting. I mean, my brain was just like freaking out. I mean, I love your questions, but imagine that times 1,000, right? And I'm trying to read them as they scroll by. And I'm looking at my watch thinking, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And then I realized, we're only going to do this for an hour. So we got to the last question. And here was the question they asked me. They said, what's the best leadership advice you've ever received? What's the best leadership advice you've ever received? Now, I was telling my mom this story. She's passed away since, but she was in her early 80s, and I was proud of her. She knew what Twitter was. And she said, that's probably a pretty hard question. She said, thank goodness you had 100 words to respond. And I said, no, Mom, it's like 100 characters to respond. She said, well, that probably got really hard. And I said, yeah, that was a really hard question to conclude the session with, but I thought it was a great question. And it's actually my final word of encouragement to you. Here's what I told the world that day on Twitter. The best leadership advice I've ever received. Above all else, guard your heart. For everything you do flows from it. Guard your heart. If you want to be a leader people want to follow, you have to guard your heart. That's my hope for you and those that you serve. If I can serve you, please reach out, and I'd love to continue the conversation. Have a great day.
Mark, thank you so much for all your encouraging words. I will certainly guard my heart. I also love how you said, think others first, which is just fantastic. Want to reach out to Matt and Sharon Lambert at Marisol. It's their 25th wedding anniversary. Want to say happy anniversary to them. The password for Mark Miller's session today is heart. And put down on the calendar, October 12th is our next Heart-Led Leader webinar series. And it's with Ethan Fisher. And I can just only tell you that Ethan is our last one for purpose. Ethan has not written a New York Times best-selling book like the last 8 speakers, but Ethan has an incredible story. He's the only one of the 9 speakers that have been to prison for 10 years. And so that's a little teaser, and has a great story about mental health. And I know a lot of the clubs are challenged in dealing with mental health issues with their staff and their club members. That's October 12th. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. Love you, brother. And I hope you have a great day, and good luck to everyone at the clubs throughout Florida. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.